We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
Hello, I'm Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, we want to wish all Americans of all nations everywhere a happy and revolutionary 4th of July. We're now only 6 years away from the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States in 1776. What is the state of this nation on this July 4th? And in what state will the world find the United States in 2026? Will America prosper or perish? The first American presidency of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton was the implementation of the economic policies of the American Revolution, a revolution that had been prepared for 60 years by Benjamin Franklin from the time he first set foot in Philadelphia as a young man of 16 in 1722. Franklin was himself the descendant of the revolutionary tradition of the Massachusetts Bay Colony established by John Winthrop in 1630. Hamilton's reports on manufactures, on the creation of a national bank, on the public credit, and on the constitutionality of a national bank declared a set of principles by means of which America would establish for all of its citizens a set of internal improvements, such as the Erie Canal, that would make America the most productive nation in history. Slavery would be eradicated through what Hamilton called artificial labor, the application of scientific breakthroughs to mass forms of production and manufactures, walking away from the systems of slavery constantly reimposed on the British colonies in America by the mother country, despite revolts and legislation against slavery from the 1670s on. Today, that revolutionary institution known as the American presidency is under seditious assault. President Donald Trump, since the second day of his coming into office in 2017, has faced a web of intelligence agencies increasingly operating from private corporations who have little to do with the constitutional government of the United States. These agencies, in various guises, including the infamous Russiagate affair or the ongoing, increasingly racialist campaign against China, also operate from the street level to attack the very cultural memory of the United States. Now, however, that a deadly pandemic threatens the world, President Trump, President Vladimir Putin of Russia, and President Xi Jinping of China, together with other heads of state, must act without the interference of private banking interests or corrupted military and financial principalities and powers to save civilization itself from sliding into a dark age, as almost happened only 75 years ago, as President Putin has recently warned in a very important article. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has recently proposed that Britain revisit the ideas, action, and leadership of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He said, "This is the moment for a Rooseveltian approach to the United Kingdom. The country has gone through a profound shock. But in those moments, you have the opportunity to change and to do things better." Presidents Xi and Putin have both often spoken of their admiration for FDR. Boris Johnson has spoken about a massive public works program. And President Trump has also spoken often about trillions of dollars to be so deployed in the United States, and has even, though not recently, spoken of reinstating Roosevelt's 1933 Glass-Steagall Act as a necessary precondition and first step for the success of a coordinated worldwide recovery. Would Boris Johnson be surprised to know that Roosevelt was implementing his own 1930s version of Alexander Hamilton's revolution against the British free trade and slave trade policy? no matter. As he said, in these moments, you have the opportunity to change. And this would not be the financial regime change called for by former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney in a declaration of war against the United States last year, a declaration also against the Trump presidency. It would also not be the Green New Deal called for by the wacky Joe Biden and even wackier weirdos of the Democratic Party, which turned its back on FDR 50 years ago. The idea that the American Revolution was merely a reaction to unjust taxation, or that it was a self-serving revolt by slave-holding landowners against the egregious, though perhaps understandable, demands of the mother country for more tribute to be extracted from the colonies. The idea of this is pathetic, irresponsible, and unforgivable. The American Revolution was a battle of ideas, ideas in science, philosophy, and culture. In particular, it was a battle against the idea of servitude, ranging from chattel slavery and caste systems to indentured servitude to the obscenity of royal titles and rankings, all based upon an externally imposed so-called natural order of predestined or acquired hierarchy. Most, according to the British idea, are simply born to be ruled, stained by an original sin of skin color or station or country of origin.
And that is our nation's historic enemy, the oligarchical, imperial, British principle, the doctrine that man is inherently evil. It was against that British and ancient satanic notion that our forefathers fought a war of independence. It is that same satanic notion which threatens our nation and the world with destruction today. And it is up to us to root it out with all of its offshoots, newt included, once and for all. Many of you in this room, and many more persons known to you, were presented with something quite foreign to real American history during the years you imagined you were acquiring an education. Straight from the hallowed halls of fraud at Britain's Oxford and Cambridge universities. Oh, you're going to save me from breaking my neck here, huh? Thank you. You were given the idea that the American Revolution was the accidental result of a nasty little spat between the generous but demanding Mother Britain and her rebellious colonial offspring, who were demanding more tea and crumpets than she could afford. Well, our founding fathers and many of their forefathers dating back to the 17th century knew better. They knew that Mother Britain, referred to by John Quincy Adams as Our Lady Macbeth Mother, was evil. They knew it from Thomas Hobbes, tutor of the bestial King Charles II. They knew Hobbes's argument in his Leviathan that by nature human society was merely a state of war of each against all. Man's inherently evil nature, said Hobbes, must be restrained under a monarchical dictatorship, a notion which the libertine Charles II found quite pleasing when he assumed the throne following the English Civil War. They knew it from John Locke, who declared that the human mind was merely a passive register of animal sensations, that man was a beast.
The late historian and revolutionary Graham Lowry, who you've just seen, did groundbreaking work and published a book called How the Nation Was Won, which tells the story, the real story of the battle of ideas in the 17th century that actually founded the real America. Today, whether it be through the prism of pandemic or financial catastrophe or cultural decadence, we in America and also throughout the world are faced with the need to make a new revolution in the axioms by which our behavior of the past half-century have been driven. Lyndon LaRouche, in his 50-year drive to reverse the slide of the United States into hell by returning it to the science of physical economy, perpetually insisted that the best thing to do with a failed system is to walk away from it.
So we have one system, which is the old banking and financial system, which is on this side. That's the dead past. We bury that. On this side, we have a new system. How do we make the transition? And how do we make it globally? Because it's a global problem. And you cannot have prosperity in part of the world and the rest of it going to hell. You must reorganize the planet as a whole. And there is a mood for that, as you can see, of many nations around this world right now. So that's what we're going to respond to, and that's what we're going to address. Now, there are three parts to address. We're going to have to use public credit. Since you cannot get private investment when private investment has gone bankrupt, in order to create large-scale projects of employment, you have to rely entirely on public credit. And I would suggest that we use the general rule, which is probably an acceptable general rule in the world today, that the public sector in economy is essentially infrastructure, government regulation of banking, which is really part of the infrastructure, the way we used to have bank regulation, and currency regulation. The government is responsible to protect the currency. Foreign trade, interstate commerce, those are the government's functions essentially in our country and similar in other countries. But the most essential characteristic of the government responsibility for economy lies in general, basic economic infrastructure. Transportation, large-scale water management systems, the development of adequate power systems, education, general education, public health, the provision of public health facilities for which the private physicians work in order to provide a health care system which is adequate for the needs of the nation, and general public education, of course, and science. The government must specifically promote science in ways which are typified, for example, by the NASA project of the 1960s, or the middle 1960s, before they began to take it down.
That is FDR for the 21st century. The LaRouche emphasis on frontier technologies associated with space, deployed as a national effort, is now inspiring an increasingly engaged international youth grouping, which is now confronted with the deaths of possibly millions of young people and others on the African continent, in South America, Asia, and at home, because of a danger of a full physical economic breakdown only partially provoked by the coronavirus threat. These young people intend to respond by inspiring all people to look, as did escaping African slaves, to the North Star, to the stars, for their salvation on earth.
On the corner of 140th Street and St. Anne's Avenue, you find St. Anne's Church, a church that's been there since 1841. And buried there lies Gouverneur Morris, one of our founding fathers and the man who penned the Constitution, who authored the preamble and fought with Hamilton to outlaw slavery. I came to visit Morris because I believe we can remodel his hometown from the poorest district in the country to a space center where people between the ages of 18 to 26 are responsible for rockets being launched into space every day. And this is not a new idea, but just a variation on a means that has been applied before. It goes back to when FDR launched the Civilian Conservation Corps as one of the many work relief programs that were created as a part of the New Deal, which completely transformed the productive capacities of the United States and created a new generation of skilled workers. The CCC had a total of 3 million people who enrolled in the program, averaging about 300,000 people a year. This demographic included roughly 5% of the nation's young men who enrolled in the program, which made up about 3 million people. But I'm not talking about any ordinary kind of relief program, but one that would literally lift mankind off the earth, into the universe and beyond, in the form of a new, revolutionary space civilian conservation corps. The youth now require a new inspiration in their lives, in the form of a nationally oriented mission back to the moon and eventually to Mars and beyond, as NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine outlined in the Artemis program. The American youth, under this program, will be at the very frontiers of scientific research and discovery, and be recruited to a workforce that will completely reshape the productivity of the nation by developing new capabilities in manufacturing, processing, and other forms of labor. This was Gouverneur Morris's intention when he wrote the preamble to the United States Constitution. humanity is directed towards a greater mission in their lives, a mission which will be told of hundreds of years after their lives. That is the general welfare. That is the United States, which did not begin as a place, but as an idea in the minds of history's greatest thinkers who dedicated their lives to improving the living standards of people who would live far after them.
0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
We got a roll program.
The LaRouche Four Laws, a return to Glass-Steagall banking regulation, the reestablishment or establishment of national banking systems, the issuance by those banks of productive credit exclusively earmarked for restarting and or expanding physical production in mining, manufacturing, and agriculture, and jump-starting economies through NASA-style applications of space and space-related technologies to the workplace, such as through laser machine tools, would give confidence to nations and the American people about the next 50 years of human progress. FDR, as the president more than any other, identified with the general welfare clause of the American Constitution written by that founding father, Gouverneur Morris, alluded to moments ago in the video on the Space CCC. What made FDR who he was? Lyndon LaRouche offered an insight into FDR's American Revolution roots in a discussion some years ago.
We're finding a great response from within sections of the American people who have been disregarded and cast aside, the lower 80% of the family income brackets, and who've been out of politics essentially, or out of control of politics for much of the past quarter century and longer. They're responding. They're responding why? Because my friends and I are intervening with people in the Democratic Party, all kinds of people, to bring them together around the idea of establishing the general welfare as a principle. The reference for that is easy. The general welfare principle, as Helga will indicate tomorrow, is an old principle in European civilization. It's one of the characteristic benefits of European civilization to all humanity, that concept as developed. The idea of the sovereign nation state as the alternative to empire. That's the great contribution. But in a most recent period, in a period which is most comparable in immediate recollection to that now, was the period of the Great Depression of the 1930s, when stupidity similar to that which rules the United States today, the stupidity of Teddy Roosevelt, that fascist, the stupidity of Woodrow Wilson, that Ku Klux Klan racist, the stupidity of Coolidge, who talked too much. That's why he didn't talk. He got himself into trouble every time he opened his mouth, so he didn't talk, at least not in public. These people, along with Mellon, destroyed the United States and destroyed much of the rest of the world. So Franklin Roosevelt came in very simply. Franklin Roosevelt had poliomyelitis, was crippled. He fought against the crippling effect of polio, and during this period restudied his own roots. He was a descendant of one of the collaborators of Alexander Hamilton some centuries before. And he studied found again his roots in the American Revolution, and brought forth as governor of New York and as candidate for president of the United States, brought forth a conception which transformed that traditionally ultra-racist party called the Democratic Party. Remember, the Democratic Party was conceived as a racist, treasonous party, and remained so until Roosevelt became president, even though there were some decent people in it from time to time. Roosevelt changed that. Roosevelt transformed the Democratic Party from the party of racism and treason into a party which is committed to the promotion of the general welfare.
There are two ways of viewing the government's duty in matters affecting economic and social life. The first sees to it that a favored few are helped and hopes that some of their prosperity will leak through, sift through, to labor, to the farmer, to the small businessman. That theory belongs to the party of Toryism, and I had hoped that most of the Tories left this country in 1776. We must lay hold of the fact that economic laws are not made by nature. They are made by human beings. Yes, when, not if, when we get the chance, the federal government will assume bold leadership in distress relief. For years, Washington has alternated between putting its head in the sand and saying there is no large number of destitute people in our midst who need food and clothing, and then saying the states should take care of them if there are. Instead of planning 2.5 years ago to do what they are now trying to do, they kept putting it off from day to day, week to week, and month to month, until the conscience of America demanded action. Out of every crisis, every tribulation, every disaster, mankind rises with some share of greater knowledge, of higher decency, of purer purpose. Today, we shall have come through a period of loose thinking, descending morals, an era of selfishness among individual men and women and among nations. Blame not governments alone for this. Blame ourselves in equal share. Let us be frank in acknowledgement of the truth that many amongst us have made obeisance to mammon, that the profits of speculation, the easy road without toil, have lured us from the old barricades. To return to higher standards, we must abandon the false prophets and seek new leaders of our own choosing. I pledge to you, I pledge myself, to a new deal for the American people. Let us all here assembled constitute ourselves prophets of a new order, of competence, and of courage. This is more than a political campaign, it is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
Not that he was able to act with a sweep of the hand to install the general welfare, but he fought to establish the principle. And most important, he fought to establish the principle in the minds of the American citizens. See, we are not emperors. We cannot, with our wave of the hand, declare a principle and then impose it by our will on people. The way we convey a principle is as philosophers in action, who convince people that that principle is the way in which they ought to live and act. And when a people is aroused to act for that principle, then the great good comes.
The idea of the philosopher in action, a practice as familiar as Socrates in the Athenian marketplace of 2,500 years ago, is also a particularly American practice. That's the difference between the method of Frederick Douglass and the method of John Brown. Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave, was an orator, a writer, and published his own newspaper in Rochester, New York. When John Brown failed to convince Douglass to join him on the doomed-to-fail Harper's Ferry raid, and when Douglass refused to side with the Boston abolitionists that preached secession by the North from the South in order to disassociate from the evil of slavery, Douglass distinguished himself as a leader of the United States. He wouldn't go along with them. Douglass's relationship with Abraham Lincoln, who relied on Douglass to lead the recruitment of over 170,000 black soldiers to fight in uniform for the Union, as well as thousands of others that did so without uniforms, was based on their mutual understanding of the United States Constitution. The preservation of the Union was not merely an expedient goal. Before the 1861 to 65 conflict, the United States was still thought to be a sort of confederacy, and the common usage was to say that the United States are. After the conclusion of the 1861-65 War of the Secession, that usage disappeared, and it became what you know today. The United States is. And the Union principle had triumphed. Douglass fought for the general welfare and won. He realized that he was embedded in a flow of history, which meant that the right actions taken by himself would affect the course of generations and centuries to follow. He did not seek to convince people that chose not to believe it that he was created equal, that he was a man, that he was human, or that he was a thinker. He simply proved it. The real American revolutionary tradition, in contrast to what you have been led to believe, has always operated that way.
The fundamental outlook respecting the nature and purpose of man is essentially the same throughout, as is the general economic policy. But the fight to realize those objectives has several distinct levels, as does the level of ideas brought to bear. To simplify the matter for discussion, the names Winthrop and Mather might best characterize the first phase, Leibniz and Swift the second phase, and Benjamin Franklin for the period reaching to the establishment of the Federal Republic. And I would propose that it's best to consider Franklin as representing the continuity of all their influences from his youth in Boston through his career in Philadelphia. Now, the continuity is important, and as John Adams put it in a letter in 1807 to Benjamin Rush, a fellow signer of the Declaration of Independence, I have always laughed at the affectation of representing American independence as a novel idea, as a modern discovery, as a late invention. The idea of it as a possible thing, as a probable event, nay, as a necessary and unavoidable measure in case Great Britain should assume an unconstitutional authority over us, has been familiar to Americans from the first settlement of the country and was as well understood by Governor Winthrop as by Governor Sam Adams.
Lyndon LaRouche, in a talk given in 2000, broadened and deepened the universal context of the American experiment even further.
From the time of the Roman Empire, at the time of the birth of Christ, civilization in the Mediterranean region had collapsed, degenerated, and continued in a degenerate form of one degree or another for about 15 centuries. But with the birth of Christ and the leadership role of his apostles, it was a new conception of man and society, which is based largely upon the foundations of the classical Greek tradition, especially the ideas associated with the work of Plato. And you'll find in the apostles, especially in the Gospel of St. John or the epistles of Paul, you'll find this conception of man on which our later foreign policy here was founded. You find it established there, especially, for example, in Paul's epistle of 1 Corinthians in chapter 13, where this concept of man was set forward.
Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass, or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long, and is kind. Charity envieth not, charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth. But whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity.
The idea is that man is not an animal. Man, unlike any other species, is capable of willfully increasing our species' power in and over the universe. This is possible because we have a power which is called technically cognition, the power to discover universal physical and other principles, to prove that those principles are correct, and to apply those principles in ways which enable us to increase man's power in and over the universe and to improve the conditions of life of the human being. This quality in the person, the quality of cognition, combined with the determination to do good in the sense of increasing man's power in the universe, in the sense of improving the conditions of life of human beings through the use of this power, was called in the ancient Greek agape. It is a term which was the subject of the original Greek version of Paul's 1 Corinthians, notably 1 Corinthians 13. For a long period of time, almost 14 centuries, from the birth of Christ, there was a struggle by Christians to establish a society which was consistent with that principle. That is, that all men and women are equally made in the image of the Creator by virtue of having this power of cognition, the quality of agape, the potential to increase man's power in and over the universe, and to improve the conditions of life through the discovery of these kinds of principles, which no animal could do. And thus we must have a society fit, a form of society fit for that quality of creature, man, cast in the image of the Creator. And it was only in the 15th century, in a period called the Golden Renaissance, that the first successful steps were made to actually establish this kind of society for which people had struggled and dreamed over the intervening 14 centuries. This developed in the middle of the 15th century around an event which is called the Council of Florence. But the enemies, the Roman feudal tradition, tried to stop the emergence of this form of society, which we call today the sovereign nation state. And therefore, powerful forces centered in Venice organized a revolt against the efforts to form this kind of society. The first such nation states based on this principle were France under Louis XI. And following that, modeled on the success of Louis XI in France, Henry VII in England founded the first modern nation state in England, though his son and successor, Henry VIII, as we all know, erred. He stepped in the wrong direction a few times. As a result of the struggle in Europe, and remember, Europe was dominated from about 1517 until the middle of the 17th century, that is 1648, by religious wars. Those who opposed the nation state in Europe tried to defend the old feudal order in one way or another by pitting parts of Europe against each other in religious wars. And terrible religious wars dominated Europe during most of the 16th century and the first half of the 17th century, until the Treaty of Westphalia. Now, it was under these conditions that people in England and elsewhere conceived of establishing a new nation state on the continent of North America. The first such venture was the founding of New England by that name by John Winthrop in 1630. And it's from that that the United States came. Now, Massachusetts was not always good. New England was not always good. It deteriorated. But nonetheless, what was done under the leadership of Winthrop and collaborators of his, such as the Mather family in education and so forth, this was the foundation of what was continued by Benjamin Franklin during the 18th century in leading this nation, or what became this nation, to founding the United States.
Gottfried Leibniz, philosopher and statesman and scientist, is one of the unacknowledged founders of the United States. Leibniz had actually founded the science of physical economy in 1672 at the age of 26 with his essay, Society and Economy. Leibniz, together with Denis Pepin, had designed a working model of a steam engine 100 years before Robert Fulton. Although Leibniz failed in his attempt to become Prime Minister of England, even after the overthrow of Massachusetts in 1690, the project of freeing mankind from servitude continued. And he continued his collaboration and correspondence with John Winthrop and James Logan of Philadelphia. This reflected Leibniz's interest not only in America, but also the level of advancement, especially in the field of iron manufacturing, that America had successfully pioneered. Science was always at the root of the orientation of the Massachusetts leadership.
So, from the first mere 800 people who landed on the shores of Massachusetts in 1630, under the guidance of John Winthrop, who became their most prominent governor and political, you might say, philosopher, scientist, engineer. The ideas were explicitly defined as, even before they set sail, it is a moral duty to develop this entire, then almost unexplored continent. It is a moral duty to do also only that which is good, just, and honest. And that's how you define Christian liberty. And to lay down your lives if need be. And as a project inherited from Europe and launched, remember, during the increasing devastations of the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, in those bleak circumstances, Winthrop compared the project in the Massachusetts Bay as the effort to construct a city upon a hill before the eyes of the entire world. Now, to make that a defensible proposition, of course, Massachusetts did a number of things which, as a state, had never been done. First of all, they managed to smuggle a charter giving them self-governing powers, elections, and essentially in every conceivable measure but the final conflict, a sovereign republic free from Britain, leaving Britain very little choice but to either come in and try to literally crush it or wait for a chance to outflank it. Winthrop, meanwhile, proceeded to develop a a citizen militia, 1,000-man strong, even by the 1630s, when King Charles first tried to say, hey, give me that charter back because it's getting out of hand, and we know what you're going to do with it if you have all this freedom to develop. They had to, therefore, also to nurture the citizenry that they were developing, create the world's first compulsory universal system of free education, which they did and built up during the 1640s. They were the first to basically establish a written constitution, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, in 1641. And they were the first to actually write the laws, and then devoted the only printing press in the colony to printing the laws. So there couldn't be any arbitrary rule by a judge saying, well, actually the law is happening this way today. And then. But instead, a continuity, a trust that the citizen could place in the laws of his own government. And his Republican participation in it, those rights were also specified and defined, as they were restraints and rights, powers of the judiciary, the legislature, and so on. All of this then enabled them to undertake an extraordinary pace of economic development, which again was the explicit outlook from the beginning. To develop this whole continent according to essentially the mandate of increase and multiply, be fruitful, subjugate nature, give due glory to the creature, but provide for man to live the best he could in the image of God. So soon they had rolling state subsidies and tax exemptions for manufacturing, this by 1640. A crash program began in 1643 to develop critical automated iron production, from blast furnaces and forges to rolling and slitting mills, and so on. And by 1647, these were fully operational and putting out more wrought iron than any of the best works in England. Massachusetts, even by this point, had already reached a population of 14,000, which did not count thousands more who'd moved on to new settlements in Connecticut. And in a further step towards economic sovereignty, they created a mint in 1642 and began issuing their own metal currency at first, the pine tree shilling, which was redeemable only within Massachusetts Bay to prevent its being drained out of the colony, subject to currency warfare and so forth. Winthrop's son, John Winthrop Jr., who had completed these ironworks, then moved on to Connecticut in 1647. He rapidly built that up. The Connecticut colonies, which were scattered, were integrated under his command and governorship by 1657, and with the so-called Restoration, which brought Hobbes's pupil Charles II to the throne in England again, the restoration of the monarchy, Winthrop maneuvered to secure a charter for Connecticut as a whole modeled on Massachusetts. Charles II wasn't in a position to dictate too many terms at first. And in December of 61, Winthrop was also elected as a founding member of the Royal Society, which ostensibly celebrates intellectual leadership, but was also there as a watchdog and a monitor. And their eyes had been attracted to what was going on in America and in New England in particular, most assuredly. John Winthrop Jr. was the leading New England intellectual of his day. He was an astronomer, a geologist, a physician, inventor. He also corresponded personally with Leibniz in his later years. He died in 1676.
The American Revolution's continuity was expressed in the person of John Quincy Adams, born in 1767, and who, at the age of 10, as the son of John Adams, acted as a spy at the French court. Adams, who spoke French, German, Russian, Greek, and Latin, among other languages, had been U.S. ambassador to Russia in 1809, Secretary of State in 1817, United States President in 1824, and as a member of the House of Representatives would die on the floor of Congress in 1848. With all his achievements, Adams' proudest moment may have been his arguing the Amistad case before the United States Supreme Court in 1841. 53 Africans from Sierra Leone, led by Cinque, had revolted on the Spanish slave ship Amistad, seized the ship, and killed the captain. They, however, were themselves seized off the coast of Long Island in 1839. The state of Connecticut had charged them with murder. American President Martin Van Buren had agreed with Spain that the Africans should be extradited to Cuba to be tried for murder there. But at the age of 73, the former president, John Quincy Adams, spoke to the Supreme Court for 9 hours and won a decision by that court to free the men, only 30 of whom were still alive. One of John Quincy Adams' pallbearers was Abraham Lincoln, a freshman congressman from Illinois. Adams, who was a literal veteran of the American Revolution, was buried, taken to his grave by the man that would initiate the Second American Revolution. Abraham Lincoln, on his way to Washington, D.C., to be inaugurated president in 1861, made the following speech in Philadelphia at Independence Hall.
You have kindly suggested to me that in my hands is the task of restoring peace to the present distracted condition of the country. I can say in return, sir, that all the political sentiments I entertain have been drawn, so far as I've been able to draw them, from the sentiments which originated and were given to the world from this hall. I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I have often pondered over the dangers which were incurred by the men who assembled here and framed and adopted that Declaration of Independence. I have often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was that kept this Confederacy so long together. It was not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, but that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence which gave liberty not alone to the people of this country, but, I hope, to the world for all future time. But if this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, I was about to say I would rather be assassinated on this spot than surrender it.
When he arrived in Washington, Lincoln would initiate the Transcontinental Railroad. He would deploy the Kentucky abolitionist Cassius Marcellus Clay to Russia, where Clay would work with Tsar Alexander II to free Russia from serfdom in 1862 as a precedent for initiating the ending of slavery in the United States in 1863. Lincoln would send Anson Burlingame as an ambassador to the China still horribly subjugated to the British Crown by the Opium Wars. And Burlingame would begin a relationship with China that would inspire Dr. Sun Yat-sen to develop his 3 principles of the people after Lincoln's government of, by, and for the people, and to propose the railroad system that is the true historic precedent for China's Belt and Road orientation today. Lincoln's economic advisor, Henry Charles Carey, author of the book The Slave Trade, Domestic and Foreign, Why It Exists and How It May Be Extinguished, said it this way.
2 systems are before the world. The one looks to increasing the proportion of persons and of capital engaged in trade and transportation, and therefore to diminishing the proportion engaged in producing commodities with which to trade, with necessarily diminished return to the labor of all, while the other looks to increasing the proportion engaged in the work of production and diminishing that engaged in trade and transportation, with increased return to all, giving to the laborer good wages and to the owner of capital goods profits. One looks to compelling the farmers and planters of the Union to continue their contributions for the support of the fleets and the armies, the paupers, the nobles, and the sovereigns of Europe. The other to enabling ourselves to apply the same means to the moral and intellectual improvement of the sovereigns of America. One looks to the centralization of wealth and power in a great commercial city that shall rival the great cities of modern times, which have been and are being supported by aid of contributions which have exhausted every nation subjected to them. The other, to concentration, by aid of which a market shall be made upon the land for the products of the land, and the farmer and planter be enriched. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks toward universal war, the other toward universal peace. One is the English system. The other we may be proud to call the American system. For it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world.
Two systems are indeed today before the world, but there is only one solution: victory over the latter-day expressions of the British Empire in Wall Street and the City of London. The American revolutionary tradition provides for a means of resolving those contradictions in individuals or parties or society that are the obstacle to progress in all people at all time, because we are not perfect. As William Shakespeare's Portia says in The Merchant of Venice, "Consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy." History will correctly judge all of us as having been flawed as individuals, and so it was with all of the founders of the nation. The mercy that we will deserve and acquire from history is our having struggled to form a more perfect union, to progress from where we are to where humanity must be. America is not so much a place as an idea. It is an idea of perfection rooted in Gouverneur Morris's preamble and the principle of the general welfare of ourselves and our posterity. The pursuit of perfection, known also as the pursuit of happiness, as called by Leibniz, were not possible without the fight to establish the ongoing revolutionary process that gives the right to perfection the means to achieve it, both for ourselves and our posterity. And it is that which is the actual revolutionary process called the American presidency. It is the duty of each citizen of the United States and each person that calls themselves an American worldwide to take it upon themselves to deploy those powers of the American presidency bequeathed by Ben Franklin, by George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and all of the others, by Frederick Douglass, by Harriet Tubman, by Sojourner Truth. It is up to us and incumbent upon us to deploy those powers of the presidency for the good of all. How might we transmit this idea of the pursuit of happiness to new generations yet unborn? The late Lyndon LaRouche addressed that problem in the following way some years ago.
She says, "Mr. LaRouche, I am a 21-year-old single mother and also a student at the university halfway through my program of studies. I've been reading your work for approximately 3 years, and I see no other ideas or projects that will get off the inclined plane on which we find ourselves, and which unfortunately appears to be endless. My question to you is this: what do we do to transmit to the majority of the world's youth who only live in the present and do so very badly the idea that they have a concrete, real, and effective future based only on cultivating the creative abilities of their minds?" Thank you.
I think fairly simply, after what I've said in this direction already today here, is that let's take the space program. We need to get at the heart of these matters in an exemplary way, and an exemplary way should also be a highly practicable way. I think the objective, because it involves a concept of a change in the image of what man is. When you go to constant acceleration as a required modality in flight of a human being from one planet to another, you're operating in a completely new kind of domain, the domain of the relativistic relations, relativistic transport. And this is a great challenge, because you have to think about when you're getting out of a one gravity situation on Earth into this kind of artificial gravity, you are in a relativistic environment. Your definition, your terms of thinking about the same old things you knew before are now presented in a new way. The human race eventually has to live in the universe. We have to live in the solar system. We have to live in the galaxy in the longer term. We have to face the challenge that represents. We have to see, you have to think like an immortal person. That is to think in such terms that you are thinking about mankind in the distant future. And you're thinking about your place in relationship to mankind in the distant future and even distant planets. Because you're looking for something in yourself which has permanent value. We're all mortal, we're born and we die. But we're not animals. We're creatively thinking creatures. And the meaning of our life does not lie in our biological existence as such. It lies in the meaning for humanity before us and after us, in what our lives have contributed to the existence of humanity as a whole. We have to see ourselves as human in that way. And therefore, the best way, practical way, is always to look ahead, to look as far ahead as you can look into the future and see what it is that you must do for the future so that your hand is at the tiller long after you're dead in that way. And obviously, if you're going to chart a course, you have to chart a good choice of course. So pick one. Pick a destiny. Pick a destiny 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations before your life today. Try to reach that far. Try to make something that you do something that contributes to the future of humanity. Find your identity in the future of humanity after death. Commit the kind of acts and kind of development that mean that. And act accordingly. Because that is the secret of true happiness. That is the pursuit of happiness as understood by Leibniz, as recorded in his second reply to Locke, which became the cornerstone of our Constitution through first the Declaration of Independence, where it is the meaning of our existence as a nation, and was reflected again in the preamble of the Constitution in its own way. We have to be immortal. We have to be immortal by assuming immortal responsibilities. Reach beyond our own life to what we can do now, which will touch in a beneficial way generations of people after we're dead. In that way, you know you're immortal. If you think like that, you know you are immortal. If you can act like that, you do even better.